It was the summer of 2005, a season when the lake town of Silverwood came alive with tourists, fishermen, and families escaping the noise of city life. Silverwood Lake was the heart of the town, stretching wide and deep, ringed by pine forests, with mist often curling off the surface in the early mornings. To locals, it was both a source of livelihood and pride. To visitors, it was a place of peace. But that peace would soon be shattered. Among the locals was David Miller, a 42-year-old mechanic known around town for his dependable nature and easygoing personality. He wasn't wealthy, but everyone respected him. His garage was the kind of place people trusted. David would sometimes fix cars for half the price if he knew the family was struggling. He was a widower, raising his teenage daughter Hannah on his own since she was a toddler. Hannah, just 14 at the time, was described as bright, curious, and artistic. She loved sketching. Her notebooks were full of drawings of birds, boats, and even portraits of her dad while he worked under the hood of cars. She was shy in public, but with her father, she was full of life. Together, they shared one tradition above all: fishing trips. David had promised Hannah that when school ended that summer, they'd take a weekend trip out on the lake, just the two of them. No distractions, no phone calls, no garage work. Just father and daughter. Hannah had been counting down the days. On the morning of June 18, 2005, they were seen at the marina. Witnesses recalled the scene in detail. Hannah in a light blue shirt and her favorite gray cap, David in his old tan fishing vest that he never went without. They loaded up their small aluminum fishing boat with a cooler full of snacks, fishing poles, life jackets, and Hannah's sketchbook. She always carried it. According to a marina worker, the two seemed happy, relaxed. David joked about how he hoped Hannah would finally catch a bigger fish than him this year. They pushed off into the lake around 9 a.m., the motor humming as the boat slowly disappeared toward the tree-lined horizon. But by mid-afternoon, something strange happened. A different fisherman spotted their boat drifting aimlessly near the center of the lake. At first, he assumed they were swimming nearby, maybe cooling off in the summer heat. But when he got closer, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The boat was empty. Inside were the fishing rods, the half-eaten snacks, the cooler, even Hannah's sketchbook, its pages damp from the lake spray but still intact, resting on the seat. The life jackets were still inside as well. But David and Hannah were nowhere in sight. Panic spread quickly. Locals knew the lake well, and they knew something wasn't right. If David and Hannah had gone for a swim, why weren't they back on the boat? Why hadn't anyone seen or heard them calling for help? By evening, the Silverwood Police Department launched a search. Boats fanned out across the lake, dragging sonar equipment. Divers plunged into the cold, murky waters, searching the depths. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the shorelines. The search went long into the night, the sound of engines echoing against the forest. But there was nothing. Not a splash, not a trace of clothing, not a single footprint on the muddy banks. It was as if David and Hannah had been swallowed whole by the lake itself. For the residents of Silverwood, the story of the Millers was devastating. David was more than just a mechanic. He was a friend, a neighbor, a father who worked hard for his only child. Hannah was just beginning her life, a girl with dreams of one day becoming an artist. Their disappearance shook the town to its core. By the next morning, the local paper carried the headline, "Father and Daughter Vanish on Silverwood Lake." For weeks, the story was all anyone could talk about. Theories began to circulate. Had they drowned? Had the boat tipped? Or was something darker at play? But the strangest detail remained. Their belongings were still in the boat, including the life jackets. If David was the careful father everyone knew him to be, he never would have let Hannah out on the lake without hers. And that question would haunt the town for years. Why would David leave behind every single thing, including the very items that could have saved their lives? What began as a quiet summer morning of fishing would soon turn into one of Silverwood's most chilling and unsolved mysteries. A mystery that, for nearly 2 decades, would remain buried beneath the lake's still waters, until nature itself unearthed a clue no one was prepared for. The discovery of the Miller family's empty boat quickly became the talk of Silverwood. To those who knew the lake, it wasn't just unusual, it was terrifying. Boats didn't just drift like that, not in calm waters. And certainly not with all the belongings still neatly inside. It was just after 2:30 p.m. when a fisherman named Carl Peters, a lifelong resident of Silverwood, noticed something unusual. He had been casting his line from the northern dock when he spotted the Miller boat swaying gently near the center of the lake. At first, he thought nothing of it. Maybe David and Hannah were taking a swim. Maybe they'd anchored nearby. But as the minutes passed, he realized no one surfaced and no one called out. Curiosity turned into unease. Carl motored over, the hum of his engine the only sound breaking the summer stillness. As he approached, the sight made his stomach drop. The small aluminum boat was empty. The fishing rods were propped neatly against the side. The cooler sat open, half a sandwich still wrapped inside. Hannah's sketchbook lay on the seat, its cover damp, with a pencil rolling gently with the rocking of the waves. And then there were the life jackets. 2 of them, folded, untouched. To Carl, that was the strangest part of all. Anyone who knew David knew he was cautious, especially with his daughter. He would never have let Hannah go without her life jacket. Carl radioed the marina immediately. Within an hour, police boats and volunteers rushed onto the lake. What began as mild concern quickly spiraled into a full-scale emergency. That evening, the Silverwood Police Department held its first briefing. The police chief, Mark Donnelly, stood before the crowd that had gathered near the marina. His words were careful, measured, but the weight behind them was heavy. We have located the Miller family's boat. Their personal items were found inside. At this time, David and Hannah are unaccounted for. Search and rescue efforts are underway. The town was stunned. David and Hannah weren't strangers. They were neighbors, friends, familiar faces everyone knew. Silverwood wasn't the kind of place where people disappeared. As night fell, search teams equipped with floodlights swept the waters. Divers slipped beneath the surface, their flashlights cutting through the murky depths. But the lake was deceptive. Silverwood was deeper than most realized, with currents that twisted unpredictably and an uneven floor of silt and rocks that could hide anything. By midnight, the search had turned desperate. Hannah's mother had passed years earlier, so there was no frantic wife at the shoreline. Instead, it was David's sister, Margaret, who arrived at the scene, her voice trembling as she begged rescuers to keep looking. She kept saying the same thing over and over. David would never let anything happen to Hannah. He wouldn't. He just wouldn't. But as dawn broke over Silverwood the next morning, the boat still bobbed at the marina, now tied down as evidence. And David and Hannah were still missing. Theories began to circulate almost immediately. Some whispered that maybe they drowned. Others thought perhaps the boat had tipped, throwing them overboard. But the life jackets told a different story. Why hadn't they been wearing them? Why had everything else, the food, the fishing gear, even Hannah's sketches, remained untouched? The unanswered questions hung in the air like a storm cloud. By the second day, it was clear this was no ordinary accident. Something was wrong, very wrong. And for the first time in decades, the quiet little town of Silverwood felt a creeping sense of fear. Fear that the lake, the place that had given them so much, was hiding something it refused to let go. By the third day of searching, Silverwood no longer felt like the same quiet town it had always been. The marina, usually alive with laughter and the buzz of boat engines, had turned into a command center. Police vehicles lined the gravel lot. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze. Volunteers carried flashlights and binoculars, whispering nervously among themselves. Word of David and Hannah's disappearance had spread far beyond the lake. Reporters began arriving, cameras in hand, eager to capture the story of the father and daughter who had simply vanished. For a town that rarely made the news, Silverwood suddenly found itself under a microscope. At the local diner, conversations stopped whenever someone walked in with fresh rumors. One customer swore he saw headlights near the shore late that night. Another insisted the boat looked too neat, too undisturbed, for 2 people to have simply drowned. Fear mingled with gossip, and every story seemed to end the same way. It just doesn't make sense. The Miller family had been well loved. David wasn't just the town's mechanic. He was the man who kept everyone's cars running through the brutal winters. Hannah was the bright young girl who handed out cookies at church fundraisers. Their absence left a hole that everyone felt. David's sister, Margaret, quickly became the face of the family's grief. She stood at the marina each day, clutching her jacket tightly, as though bracing against an invisible storm. "Please," she told reporters, her voice breaking, "don't treat this like just another story. My brother and my niece are out there. Someone knows something." Behind closed doors, though, the town wasn't just grieving. It was beginning to turn on itself. Old suspicions surfaced. Some whispered that David might have had enemies, someone who wanted him gone. Others wondered if it had something to do with Hannah, that maybe she had seen or known something she wasn't supposed to. The police tried to calm the speculation. Chief Donnelly urged patience. "We have no evidence of foul play at this time," he said during a tense town hall meeting. But his reassurances did little to ease the tension. For many, the lack of answers was worse than bad news. Search parties combed the surrounding woods. Flyers with David and Hannah's pictures appeared on telephone poles and storefronts. The words, "missing, last seen on Silverwood Lake," stared back at every passerby. Still, day after day, the lake gave nothing back. No footprints on the muddy banks. No clothes snagged on branches. No bodies. Nothing. The silence of the lake grew heavier, almost suffocating. It was as though the water itself had sealed its lips, guarding a secret too dark to share. And in a place like Silverwood, where everyone thought they knew everyone, that silence became unbearable. For the first time in decades, people locked their doors at night. Parents told their children to stay close. Boats stayed tied at the docks, swaying gently in the breeze, but never leaving. The town had begun to fear the very lake that had once been its pride. And through it all, the empty Miller boat remained docked at the marina, tied up with heavy rope. Some residents swore they couldn't look at it without feeling a chill. It sat there as a constant reminder, not just of what was missing, but of the unanswered question that haunted everyone's thoughts. If David and Hannah weren't in the lake, then where were they? The search for David and Hannah soon became the largest operation Silverwood had ever seen. What began as a small-town effort quickly escalated into a coordinated mission involving local police, state troopers, and specialized dive teams brought in from neighboring counties. The lake, once beloved for its beauty, now felt like an enemy. Divers in thick wetsuits slipped beneath its dark surface, their flashlights cutting into the murky water. Silverwood Lake was deep, far deeper than most people realized, with jagged rocks, sudden drop-offs, and heavy layers of silt that could swallow anything whole. For hours, they searched. They dredged the bottom, scanning with sonar equipment, dragging nets across the lakebed. Boats circled the surface, their motors growling, while volunteers stood on shore scanning with binoculars, hoping for even the smallest sign. But the lake gave nothing. On the first night, police found only silence. By the second night, frustration was setting in. "We're not dealing with a typical drowning," one officer was overheard telling a colleague. "If they'd gone under near their boat, we'd have found something by now." Rumors spread even faster. Some townsfolk said the boat must have drifted in from another part of the lake, that maybe David and Hannah had never even made it that far. Others whispered darker theories, that someone had staged the scene to look like an accident. Still, Chief Donnelly insisted the search continue. "Until we have evidence otherwise," he told reporters. "We treat this as a recovery mission." Divers went down again and again, sometimes surfacing with bloodshot eyes, shaking their heads. One diver, a veteran with 20 years of experience, later admitted quietly, "It felt wrong down there." Like the lake didn't want to give them up. By the end of the week, search teams had scoured nearly every inch of the lake. They found lost fishing lures, old beer cans, even the rusted shell of an outboard motor long forgotten. But of David and Hannah, no trace. The lack of evidence only deepened the mystery. If they had drowned, why hadn't their bodies surfaced? If they'd been swept away, why hadn't anything washed up on shore? And then came another question, one that gnawed at the town's nerves. What if David and Hannah hadn't drowned at all? Theories shifted. Some residents began to wonder if the pair had disappeared on purpose. Maybe David was running from something. Maybe he'd decided to vanish and take Hannah with him. But those who knew David best rejected the idea. He loved Silverwood. He loved his daughter. He had no reason to leave. Margaret, his sister, begged the police not to give up. She stood at the edge of the marina every day, clutching Hannah's damp sketchbook, the one found in the boat. "They're out there," she insisted, tears running down her face. "I don't care what anyone says. They didn't just vanish into thin air." But as days turned into weeks, the reality set in. Without bodies, without clues, the search could not go on forever. Slowly, the flood of volunteers thinned. The police reduced their patrols. The divers packed their gear and drove away. And Silverwood was left with nothing but an empty boat, an unanswered question, and a lake that seemed to swallow truth itself. When weeks of searching turned up nothing, the mood in Silverwood began to change. At first, the town had clung to hope. Maybe David and Hannah would be found alive. Maybe they'd drifted to another shore. Maybe there was still a chance. But hope soon gave way to suspicion. People started asking the questions no one had dared to before. What if this wasn't an accident? Theories spread like wildfire. Some whispered that David had enemies, quiet grudges from his work at the garage. A man who had once argued with David over a repair bill swore he was too trusting. He probably crossed the wrong person. Others muttered that maybe the disappearance had something to do with Hannah, that she had seen or overheard something she wasn't supposed to, and someone had silenced both of them. Even the police couldn't ignore the strange details. The life jackets, untouched. The fishing gear, undisturbed. Hannah's sketchbook left behind. If they had simply drowned, why had everything been left so perfectly in place? Chief Donnelly admitted in a press briefing, "We cannot rule out the possibility of foul play." That single statement changed everything. The town split into factions. Some believed David had taken his daughter and run. They pointed out how thoroughly the search had come up empty, as though the Millers had simply walked off the face of the earth. Others believed the opposite, that someone close to the family had orchestrated their disappearance. Margaret, David's sister, fought against the rumors. She stood before reporters, her voice trembling but defiant. "My brother was a good man. He adored Hannah. He would never run away, and he would never let anyone harm her. Something else happened out there." But even within her own circle, doubts lingered. One of David's old friends admitted, "Look, I love the guy, but we don't know everything about anyone. Maybe he got into something he couldn't get out of." The police began looking deeper into David's past. They discovered a handful of unpaid bills, a few disagreements with suppliers, and late-night calls from numbers traced to outside the county. None of it proved anything sinister, but it was enough to fuel the town's imagination. Then there were the stories about the lake itself. Silverwood had long carried legends of strange lights seen on the water, of sudden whirlpools that dragged things down, of secrets hidden beneath its depths. Old-timers leaned on those tales, claiming the Millers had been claimed by something more than nature. For Hannah's classmates, the theories were even crueler. Teenagers whispered that maybe David had snapped, that maybe he'd dragged Hannah into the lake himself. Others said Hannah had planned to run away, and her father had helped her vanish. The truth was, no one knew. And with every rumor, every theory, every whispered accusation, Silverwood drifted further from unity. The town wasn't just grieving anymore. It was tearing itself apart. By the end of that summer, the case of David and Hannah Miller had stopped being just a mystery. It had become a story everyone claimed to know the ending to, even though not a single shred of evidence pointed to what really happened. And beneath it all, the lake remained silent, holding its secrets close. As summer turned into fall, investigators began shifting their attention away from the lake and toward David Miller himself. If the water wasn't giving up its secrets, maybe the answers lay in his past. On the surface, David seemed like the kind of man everyone respected. A widower raising his daughter alone, a mechanic who worked long hours at his garage, someone who was always willing to lend a hand. But as police dug deeper, a more complicated picture began to emerge. Financial records showed that David had been under pressure. His garage was doing steady business, but not enough to keep up with the mounting debts he'd inherited after his wife passed. He was behind on payments to suppliers. A notice from the bank suggested he was at risk of losing the property if he couldn't catch up. Then there were the phone records. In the months leading up to his disappearance, David had received multiple calls late at night from unfamiliar numbers traced to another county. Investigators interviewed a few of his acquaintances, and while most described him as dependable, a few admitted he had been unusually distracted in recent weeks. He seemed on edge, one customer told police, like something was weighing heavy on him. The whispers grew darker. Some began to suggest David might have been involved in things he kept hidden from the town, that maybe he'd taken on side jobs, or worse, that he owed money to the wrong people. A rumor even circulated that he'd once worked briefly in another state, where a dispute with a former partner ended badly. But for every accusation, there was someone ready to defend him. Margaret, his sister, dismissed the talk as cruel gossip. David wasn't perfect, she admitted, but he wasn't reckless. He lived for Hannah. Everything he did, he did for her. Friends recalled how often David spoke about wanting Hannah to have a better life than he did. He dreamed of saving enough to send her to art school someday. He even kept some of her sketches pinned up on the wall of his office at the garage. Yet, even those closest to him couldn't ignore the fact that David had secrets, small, unexplained gaps in his life, decisions no one fully understood. One detail in particular unsettled investigators. A neighbor reported seeing David at the garage late at night only a week before the fishing trip, arguing with someone in a pickup truck that didn't belong to anyone local. The witness couldn't hear what was said, but described the exchange as heated, ending with the other driver speeding off into the darkness. Could this encounter have been connected to what happened on the lake? Was the fishing trip a coincidence, or was David trying to get away from something? Theories only multiplied. Some said David might have staged his own disappearance, taking Hannah with him to start a new life. Others insisted that if David had enemies, perhaps they had followed him to the lake that morning. But without evidence, every lead ended in silence. To the outside world, the mystery deepened. To those in Silverwood, however, one truth remained painfully clear: whether David was a man with hidden struggles or simply a devoted father caught in something bigger than himself, he and Hannah were still gone. And the lake, or someone connected to it, wasn't talking. As investigators combed through the Miller home, hoping for any clue that might explain the disappearance, they came across something unexpected: a sketchbook belonging to 14-year-old Hannah. At first glance, it was exactly what you'd expect from a young girl who loved art. Pages filled with pencil drawings of her school friends, her dog, even flowers from the backyard. But as detectives flipped further, the tone began to shift. In one drawing, Hannah had sketched a small boat on Silverwood Lake. The detail was striking: the outline of a man fishing and a girl beside him. But looming behind them was a shadow, drawn larger than the figures themselves, hovering in the background like a dark cloud. Another page showed a pickup truck parked outside what looked like her father's garage. Above the truck, Hannah had scribbled jagged lines, almost like storm clouds. Inside the truck, she had shaded a figure in heavy black, faceless, ominous. Detectives weren't sure what to make of it. Were these the innocent doodles of a girl with a vivid imagination, or had Hannah been trying to capture something she'd actually seen? Margaret, David's sister, was shaken when police showed her the drawings. She was a sensitive child, she explained. She picked up on things. If David was stressed, she felt it. Sometimes she would draw what she couldn't put into words. One sketch in particular disturbed her. It showed a house by the lake, not their home, but one with broken shutters and a sagging roof. Standing in front of it were two stick-like figures, one tall, one small, both holding hands. Across the bottom, Hannah had scrawled a single word in uneven letters: gone. Investigators began to wonder. Had Hannah overheard conversations between her father and whoever was calling him late at night? Had she seen the arguments? Was her sketchbook a diary of things she was too afraid to say out loud? The sketchbook was bagged as evidence, but not before leaving a lasting chill in the room. For the first time, police had something that hinted this disappearance might not have been accidental at all. When the drawings were quietly shown to a child psychologist, the interpretation was grim. The faceless figure, the shadow, the storm clouds, all classic signs of fear, secrecy, or danger. The word gone wasn't a doodle. It was a message. But a message about what? Was Hannah warning that she and her father were planning to leave? Or was she trying to tell someone that they were in danger? The sketchbook, like everything else in the case, posed more questions than answers. But to many in Silverwood, it confirmed what they had suspected all along. Something sinister was at play, and a 12-year-old girl may have sensed it before anyone else. As detectives followed the trail of clues, one name kept resurfacing in interviews: the lake house. Silverwood Lake was known for its scenic cabins, many of them family-owned for generations. But tucked along the farthest edge of the shoreline, hidden by overgrown trees and a crumbling dirt path, stood a property few people visited anymore. Locals described it as the Old Dawson Place, a weathered cabin with boarded windows and a dock that sagged dangerously into the water. Some said David Miller had been seen there in the months before he vanished, his truck parked out front late at night. Others swore they saw a light flickering inside, long after the cabin was supposed to be abandoned. When investigators finally got a warrant to search the house, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. Inside, The air was damp and stale, carrying the smell of mold and rotting wood. The living room was nearly empty, except for a broken chair and a pile of beer bottles in the corner. But upstairs, the officers found something that stopped them cold. In one of the bedrooms, someone had pinned photos to the wall, snapshots of Silverwood Lake, the Miller family home, and even one of Hannah walking home from school. None of the photos were dated, and none of them were in frames. They were tacked to the wall like a collage, as though someone had been watching and waiting. On the floor, beneath the photos, was a spiral-bound notebook. Its pages were filled with scrawled notes, most of them messy and incoherent. But one entry stood out. Written in block letters across a torn sheet, it read, "She knows." Detectives exchanged uneasy glances. Who was she? Did it refer to Margaret? To Hannah? Or someone else entirely? Back at the precinct, the notebook and photos were treated as critical evidence. But just as quickly, rumors exploded across Silverwood. Some claimed David had been leading a double life, meeting someone secretly at the cabin. Others believed the opposite, that David had stumbled onto something dangerous, and the cabin was a place where his enemies had left their warning. Margaret, when shown the photographs of Hannah, broke down in tears. She was just a child, she whispered. Why would anyone follow her like that? The discovery shook the town to its core. For the first time, the case was no longer just about a father and daughter vanishing. It was about surveillance, secrets, and a chilling possibility. Someone had been planning this. And in the quiet shadows of Silverwood Lake, that old abandoned cabin had gone from forgotten to the centerpiece of the mystery. After the chilling discovery inside the lake house, the pinned photographs and the note that simply read, "She knows," investigators dug deeper. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom, one officer uncovered something even more disturbing, a small leather-bound journal. Unlike the messy notebook filled with incoherent ramblings, this journal was careful, deliberate, and written with a heavy hand. The first few pages seemed ordinary, reminders, fishing trips, errands. But as detectives read further, the entries began to darken. One passage, dated only weeks before David's disappearance, made every officer in the room freeze. "She keeps asking questions. She saw too much that night. I can't let her ruin everything. If she talks, it all ends." The handwriting was jagged, pressing so hard into the paper it nearly tore through. But the entry that disturbed them the most was the one on the very last page. Friday, after sunset, by the water. It has to be done. No one can ever know. The date matched the exact night David and Hannah vanished. Detectives now faced a terrifying possibility. Someone had been planning their disappearance all along. But whose journal was it? The scrawled handwriting didn't match David's neat signature from his driver's license. Margaret confirmed it wasn't his. And when handwriting analysts compared it to known samples from other suspects, nothing lined up. It belonged to someone still unknown. Meanwhile, whispers spread through Silverwood like wildfire. Neighbors began to wonder if the person behind the journal was living among them, hiding in plain sight. Every unfamiliar face in town became a suspect. Every late-night knock or strange sound near the lake sent chills down people's spines. For Margaret, the revelations were almost unbearable. If someone wanted to hurt David, she said through tears, why take Hannah too? She was just a little girl. Detectives had no answer for her. But one thing was clear. Whoever wrote the journal wasn't just documenting thoughts. They were recording a plan. And that plan ended on the shores of Silverwood Lake, the very night father and daughter vanished without a trace. The journal was no longer just evidence. It was a message, and its last words suggested that someone had carried out that plan. Just when investigators feared the case was hitting another dead end, a phone call came into the sheriff's office. On the line was an elderly woman named Clara Dawson, a longtime resident of Silverwood. She spoke with a shaky voice, almost whispering, as if she were afraid someone might overhear. Clara claimed she had been holding on to a secret for years. She said that on the very night David and Hannah disappeared, she had seen something by the lake, something she never told anyone. Detectives drove straight to her home, a small, weather-beaten house on the edge of town. Clara was waiting on her porch, clutching a worn shawl around her shoulders. Her eyes darted nervously as if the shadows themselves were listening. Inside, she poured tea with trembling hands before finally speaking. I shouldn't have kept this to myself, she confessed. But back then, I was scared. I didn't want to get involved. Everyone in this town knows what happens when you poke around too much in other people's business. Detectives leaned in as Clara described that night. She said she had trouble sleeping and often went on late walks near the lake. That evening, around midnight, she heard raised voices near the old dock. At first, she thought it was just teenagers. But when she stepped closer, she froze. Under the moonlight, she claimed she saw David arguing with another man. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a cap pulled low. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she remembered the way he kept jabbing his finger at David's chest. Then, she noticed something even more chilling. Hannah was there too, sitting on the edge of the dock, clutching her backpack. Clara swore she heard David shout, "You don't have to do this," before the man shoved him hard against the wooden rail. That's when Clara panicked. Afraid she might be seen, she backed away quietly and hurried home, locking her doors. The next morning, when news spread that David and Hannah were missing, she nearly told the police. But fear silenced her. "I thought maybe I imagined it. Or maybe it wasn't my place," she said, her voice breaking. Now, years later, the guilt had eaten away at her. She couldn't stay silent anymore, especially after hearing about the journal found in the lake house. Detectives were stunned. Clara's account lined up with the timing in the journal. Whoever wrote it had mentioned Friday, after sunset, by the water. She had unknowingly witnessed part of that planned meeting. But one question remained. Who was the man in the cap? Clara hesitated when asked. Then, almost whispering, she said, "I didn't recognize him that night. But something about his walk, it reminded me of someone from town." The detectives pressed her, but Clara wouldn't say more. Whether out of fear or uncertainty, she left the identity hanging in the air like smoke. Still, her testimony was the first real eyewitness account they'd ever had. And it proved one thing beyond doubt. David and Hannah's disappearance wasn't an accident. It was a confrontation, a planned meeting that turned deadly. And the man in the cap? He was still out there. The story of Clara Dawson spread quickly through the investigative team. Her testimony cracked open a door that had been sealed for nearly 2 decades. But what detectives didn't expect was how quickly the town of Silverwood would start whispering about who the man in the cap might have been. Silverwood was a small town, and secrets didn't stay buried forever. Old rivalries, grudges, and betrayals had a way of resurfacing when the past was disturbed. One name began to rise above the rest: Earl Whitman. Earl was no stranger to law enforcement. Back in the early 2000s, he was known for running with a rough crowd, men who did shady deals in the shadows of the logging industry. He had been arrested multiple times for bar fights and illegal gambling, but nothing had ever stuck long enough to put him away. What made investigators pay attention now was a detail most people had forgotten. Earl had once worked with David's father at the sawmill. Their relationship soured after rumors of stolen money and missing shipments. Some said Earl had sworn revenge on the family. When detectives dug deeper, they found something even more unsettling. Earl had suddenly left Silverwood right after David and Hannah's disappearance. He sold his small house, cut ties, and vanished into the wind. For years, no one knew where he had gone. But 2 weeks before Clara's statement, Earl Whitman had returned. Quietly, almost as if he knew the case was heating up again. Witnesses spotted him at the old tavern on Main Street, sitting in the corner with his cap pulled low, drinking whiskey in silence. Some locals claimed he looked older, more worn down, but his eyes still carried that same dangerous edge. Detectives couldn't ignore the coincidence. Clara's description of the man on the dock, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a cap, fit Earl perfectly. And the fact that he had returned just as the journal and eyewitness testimony surfaced, it was too much to overlook. They decided to bring him in for questioning. When Earl sat down in the interrogation room, he leaned back casually, smirking as if he had been expecting this moment all along. "I heard you're stirring up old ghosts," he said, his gravelly voice filling the room. "But you're wasting your time. David and Hannah? They're gone. Everyone knows that." Detectives pressed him about where he was the night of the disappearance. Earl shrugged, claiming he had been out of town on a trucking job. But when asked for proof, he couldn't provide any. His demeanor was confident, almost mocking. But beneath the surface, detectives sensed cracks. His hand twitched whenever they mentioned David's name. His jaw tightened when they asked about Hannah. Finally, one detective slid a photo across the table, a grainy image of the old dock from that era. "Clara Dawson saw you here. the detective said firmly. She saw you with David. For the first time, Earl's smirk faded. His eyes flickered, just for a second, and then he leaned forward, voice low and dangerous. Careful what you're accusing me of. People around here tend to forget. Sometimes the past is better left buried. With that, he refused to say another word. Earl was released due to lack of hard evidence. But the message was clear. The man in the cap wasn't just a rumor anymore. He was real. He was back. And he wasn't afraid. The town of Silverwood was buzzing after word spread that Earl Whitman had been questioned. Some residents whispered that justice might finally be catching up to him. Others feared that stirring up his name would only bring trouble. But for detectives, there was no turning back. If Earl truly was the man Clara Dawson saw on the dock, there had to be evidence somewhere that tied him to David and Hannah's disappearance. That's when a tip came in from an unlikely source, a retired game warden named Howard Briggs. Howard had spent most of his life patrolling the deep forests around Silverwood, making sure hunters respected the land and logging companies didn't overstep boundaries. But in all those years, he had also noticed things that never made it into official reports. When detectives interviewed him, Howard leaned on his cane, his weathered face shadowed by memory. I remember that summer of '07 clear as day, he said. People thought it was just another logging season, but there were places out in those woods where things didn't sit right. Fresh tire tracks where there shouldn't have been. Fires burning late at night. And once, he paused, his voice low. Once I came across Earl Whitman's truck parked near an abandoned cabin. Middle of the night. No reason for him to be there. Detectives' ears perked up. A cabin. Deep in the forest. Howard gave them directions, his shaky hand drawing a map on an old notepad. It wasn't easy to find. The kind of place only someone who knew the land by heart could reach. The very next morning, a team of investigators hiked into the woods, following Howard's map. Hours passed as they trudged through thick underbrush and overgrown trails. Finally, half hidden by pine trees and wrapped in decades of decay, they found it, the cabin. The windows were shattered. The roof sagged with moss and rot. But the moment they stepped inside, the air grew heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding onto secrets. At first, it looked like nothing but the ruins of an old hunting shack. Empty beer bottles, rusted tools, graffiti from kids who had stumbled across it years later. But then one detective noticed something odd, a section of the floorboards that looked newer than the rest. Carefully, they pried them up. Beneath the wood was a small compartment, and inside, a handful of items that froze everyone in place. A faded blue scarf, its fabric torn and stained with something long dried. A rusted pocket knife, engraved with initials, DH. And tucked at the bottom, a photograph, weathered and curled from time, showing an adult and girl smiling at a county fair, David and Hannah. The room went silent. It wasn't proof of murder, not yet. But it was undeniable evidence that the cabin had been connected to their disappearance. When detectives presented the items to Clara Dawson, her hands trembled. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "That scarf. Hannah wore it all the time. She never went anywhere without it." The discovery blew the case wide open. Earl Whitman's name was now more than suspicion. It was tied to a physical location, a hideout in the woods that no one had known about until now. But the evidence also posed a terrifying question. If David and Hannah had been brought here, what happened to them after that night? And more disturbingly, was Earl the only one who knew the cabin existed? Back at the station, detectives carefully laid out the evidence from the cabin. The scarf, the knife, the photograph. Each piece was sealed in bags, waiting for forensic testing. But there was something else weighing heavily on their minds, David's journal. Up to this point, the journal had been like a puzzle, full of teenage emotions and cryptic references to the man at the docks. Yet, the last few pages had always seemed different, more rushed, more desperate, almost as if David knew time was running out. One of the lead detectives, Harper, sat in the quiet evidence room, the journal open before him. He flipped back to those final entries, his fingers tracing over the shaky handwriting. The first line chilled him. "If anyone finds this, know that Hannah and I didn't just run away. We were taken." Harper leaned closer, his heart pounding. David had written more. "It was late when we got back from the dock. Hannah kept saying she felt like someone was watching us. Then, a truck came up behind us. Big, loud, old. I recognized it. It was Earl's. He told us to get in. Said he'd take us home. But the way he looked at us, I knew something wasn't right. I told Hannah not to say anything. The detective turned the page, his hand shaking slightly. He didn't take us home. He drove us to the woods. To that cabin. I tried to keep Hannah calm, but she was crying. Earl said no one would find us there. That people wouldn't even know where to start looking. The words trailed off in places, smeared by what looked like rain or tears. But then came the last full entry, one that made Harper's breath catch in his throat. I don't know if we'll get out. I hear him outside, talking to someone. Another voice. Not sure who. If this is my last entry, please, don't stop looking for us. Tell Mom I love her. Tell them Hannah was scared but brave. Don't let them forget us. The room fell silent. David's journal didn't just point to Earl Whitman. It suggested something even darker, that he wasn't working alone. Detectives gathered around as Harper read the words aloud. The weight of David's plea hung heavy in the air. Not only had he recorded their abduction, but he had also hinted that someone else was part of it. Who was the second voice? Another local? A friend of Earl's? Or someone entirely unsuspected? The discovery rattled Silverwood once again. People who had long buried their suspicions now came forward with old stories, strange sounds in the woods, missing dogs, rumors about men gathering in cabins late at night. It painted a chilling picture, one that went far beyond a single man's crime. For David and Hannah's families, the journal was both a gift and a torment. It proved they hadn't just vanished into thin air, that their final hours were recorded by David's own hand. But it also confirmed their worst fear, that their children's fate had been in the hands of dangerous men. And if Earl Whitman wasn't acting alone, that meant the real story of Silverwood's missing teens was still hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Detectives had spent months chasing shadows, their leads going cold one after another. But when the recovered journal was re-examined under ultraviolet light, a startling discovery was made. Faint fingerprints, smeared but partially intact, lined the corners of the pages. The prints didn't match David. They didn't match Margaret. They didn't even match Frank, the neighbor who first became a suspect. Instead, the system flagged a hit. Ethan Cole, a former handyman in Silverwood, known for odd jobs around town. Ethan had moved out of Silverwood a year before David's disappearance, but locals remembered him well. He was quiet, withdrawn, but always seemed to be watching. Some even recalled seeing him near the lake on late nights, though no one ever knew why. When detectives tracked him down, they found him living in a rundown trailer 2 counties over. At first, Ethan denied everything. I don't know nothing about that lake. Haven't been there in years, he said nervously. But when investigators laid the journal in front of him, his face drained of color. His prints were undeniable. And though he insisted he had never written a word in that book, one detail betrayed him. A doodle on the margin of one page, a crude drawing of a fishhook. Margaret gasped when she saw it. David had once hired Ethan to help build their dock, and Ethan had left behind similar sketches on scraps of wood. She remembered David joking about Ethan's fishhook obsession. But the question remained, what was his motive? As detectives pressed him, cracks began to show. Ethan admitted he had once worked odd jobs for David, but claimed their relationship soured after David refused to pay him for what Ethan believed was extra work. He insisted that resentment, not violence, was all that lingered. Yet when asked where he was the night David and Hannah disappeared, Ethan stumbled. His alibi was shaky, built on vague memories of being at home, alone. For the first time, the case had a living, breathing suspect tied to both the evidence and the timeline. But Silverwood wasn't ready to accept this new revelation so easily. Whispers spread once again. Some believed Ethan had been framed. Others were convinced he was the shadow lurking at the edges of town all along. Margaret, torn between hope and dread, clung to a single thought. If Ethan knows something, then maybe David and Hannah's story isn't over yet. Detectives faced a choice: press harder and risk scaring Ethan into silence, or wait and watch, hoping he would slip up. And then, just as they were preparing to bring him in for further questioning, an anonymous letter arrived at the sheriff's office. It contained only 5 words, scrawled in the same jagged handwriting as the journal. He wasn't the only one. The chilling message meant one thing. If Ethan Cole was involved, he hadn't acted alone. Someone else was still out there, and they were watching. The anonymous letter shook everyone to the core. He wasn't the only one. Detectives had believed Ethan Cole might finally be the answer. But the note suggested something far darker, a conspiracy. Someone else had been in the shadows all along. Investigators dug deeper, revisiting every scrap of evidence. When they re-examined the map sketched inside the journal, they noticed faint pencil marks leading beyond the lake, out toward the abandoned Silverwood mines, sealed off decades ago after a collapse. Margaret remembered David once mentioning those mines. He said they gave him a bad feeling, as though something was buried there no one wanted found. At the time, she thought it was just small-town superstition. Now, it felt like a clue David had tried to leave behind. Search teams entered the mine shaft carefully, their flashlights cutting through the dust. And there, in a narrow tunnel, they discovered something that stopped them cold, a crude underground chamber. Inside were old lanterns, torn blankets, and scraps of food wrappers dating back over 10 years. Someone had lived there. Someone had kept secrets there. And carved into the wall, scratched in desperation, were the words, "Don't trust him." The handwriting matched David's. But there was more. Buried beneath the floorboards of the chamber, investigators unearthed bones. DNA confirmed the unthinkable. They belonged to Hannah, David's daughter, who had vanished the same night as David. The discovery shattered Margaret. For years, she had prayed Hannah might still be alive somewhere. But the remains told a different story, one of betrayal, silence, and cruelty. The evidence began pointing in a new direction. Ethan Cole hadn't built this chamber alone. He wasn't smart enough, meticulous enough. Someone else had guided him. Someone who knew the mines, the woods, and the lake better than anyone. That man was Frank Miller, the friendly neighbor who had first drawn suspicion before being quietly ruled out. Frank had grown up in Silverwood. His father worked in those very mines. He knew every tunnel, every hidden path. When detectives returned to question him, Frank broke down. He confessed he had lured David to the mines the night of his disappearance, claiming he wanted to show him something. Ethan was there too. What began as intimidation over unpaid debts spiraled out of control when Hannah unexpectedly followed David. In panic, the men turned on both of them. David fought back, leaving scratches on Frank's arms. But in the struggle, tragedy struck. Hannah was silenced forever, and David was dragged into the chamber, forced to leave behind that desperate warning etched into the wall. But here's where the mystery deepened. Frank swore David didn't die that night. He claimed Ethan had taken David away, insisting he had plans for him. Whether that was true or just a desperate lie, no body was ever recovered. Margaret was left with only fragments of truth. Hannah's death confirmed, but David's fate forever uncertain. Had he perished in the mines? Had Ethan hidden him elsewhere? Or had he escaped, choosing never to return out of fear of those who betrayed him? Silverwood would never know. Years later, Margaret often visited the lake at sunset, staring at the ripples across the water. The mystery of her brother's disappearance remained, but the truth about the darkness beneath her quiet town had finally come to light. The journal, the bones, the confession, they told a story of greed, betrayal, and fear. Yet they also revealed something deeper, that even in his final hours, David fought to leave behind a message, a warning, a fragment of truth for the woman he loved. And though she never found his body, Margaret carried that truth with her until her final days. Silverwood was no longer the same. The whispers of the mines, the empty cabin, the shadows by the lake, they became a reminder of how secrets can bury themselves deep in a town's soil, until someone is brave enough to uncover them. As for David, his name still lingers like a ghost across Silverwood. Some believe he rests beneath the earth. Others swear they've seen him, a figure on the lake at dawn, watching in silence. But one thing remains certain. The truth never stays buried forever.